My name is Miriam Calloway. I'm 38 years old. 3 months after my father died, a stranger knocked on my door and handed me a notice of sale for the house I had lived in for 23 years. A house my stepmother had already transferred out of my name using a document I had never signed. 23 years, one document, gone. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that my father had kept the original deed, the one from before he ever met her, in a lockbox in the back of his closet. And he had added my name to it 11 years ago without ever telling her. The morning, I walked into the county recorder's office with that deed in my hand and watched her attorney's face go completely still. That was the moment I understood what my father had been preparing for. Before I tell you how we got there, hit subscribe, hit like, and let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what that house meant before you can understand what getting it back cost. The house on Weller Street in Columbus, Ohio, was not a beautiful house. I want to be honest about that, because this story is about that house, and I don't want you picturing something it wasn't. It was a 1960s split-level beige siding that had faded to something closer to the color of old newspaper, a front porch that listed slightly to the left, a yard that my father watered faithfully every summer and still never managed to make fully green. It had 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a kitchen that smelled permanently of the spice rack my mother had hung on the wall in 1989, and a basement that flooded a little every spring. It was, to me, the most important place in the world. My father, Gerald Calloway, had bought that house in 1981 with my mother, Patricia. He was 26 years old, working as a machinist, and my mother was 24 and 3 months pregnant with me. The down payment had come from his parents, my grandparents, Lionel and Ruth Calloway, who had pressed an envelope into his hand the week before closing and told him not to argue about it. My mother died when I was 15. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in January, gone by October of the same year. I want to tell you about her because she matters to this story even though she was gone before most of it happened. Patricia Calloway was a woman who believed that the most important thing you could leave a person was certainty. Not things. Certainty. She used to say, "Miriam, when things get uncertain, you go back to what you know is solid. You go back to your foundation." The house on Weller Street was her foundation. She painted the kitchen yellow. She planted the rose bushes along the south fence. She is the one who hung the spice rack. After she died, my father and I lived in that house together for 7 years, just the two of us. He worked. I went to school, went to community college, got a job as a paralegal at a small firm in Worthington. We ate dinner together most nights. We watched crime procedurals on Friday evenings. We did not talk about my mother as much as we probably should have, but we both felt her in every room, and I think that was its own kind of conversation. I was 22 when my father met Diane. I need you to understand what the house meant before I go any further, because this story is not really about a house. It is about what a house can hold. It holds my mother's handwriting on the inside of a kitchen cabinet, where she recorded my height in pencil from the time I was 3 until I was 14. It holds the place on the basement wall where my father marked how high the water reached each spring flood, going back to 1983. It holds the dent in the living room baseboard from the time I was 8, and launched a toy rocket that went sideways. It holds my entire life before everything went wrong. When I tell you what Diane did with that house, what she tried to do, I need you to know that she knew all of this. She had been in every room. She had seen my mother's pencil marks. She had eaten at the kitchen table. She knew exactly what she was taking. And she did it anyway. My father met Diane Pollock at a church potluck dinner in the spring of 2008. He came home that night and told me a woman named Diane had made a very good green bean casserole. I thought nothing of it. 2 months later, he mentioned her again. She had a daughter, he said. Grown, living in Arizona. She'd been widowed 4 years earlier. Her husband, Frank Pollock, had been a general contractor. She'd moved to Columbus from Akron to be closer to her sister. She seems like a good person, my father said. He was looking at the table when he said it, not at me. I told him I was glad. And I was. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to read this story and assume I was one of those daughters who couldn't let her father move on. I wasn't. My mother had been gone for 7 years. My father was 53 years old. He deserved to have someone. I genuinely believed that. Diane Pollock was 50 years old when I met her. She was trim, well-dressed, with silver-streaked hair she wore in a neat bun, and a way of tilting her head when she listened to you that made you feel like what you were saying was the most interesting thing she'd heard all week. She was warm. She asked good questions. She brought a lemon cake the first time she came to dinner, and she did not try too hard or too little. She had clearly thought about exactly how to calibrate herself. That calibration, I would eventually understand, was not charm. It was strategy. But that first year, I saw none of it. What I saw was a woman who made my father laugh for the first time in years. What I saw was someone who sat with him on the back porch on summer evenings and didn't try to talk him out of his quietness. What I saw was a man who was slowly becoming less gray around the edges. They married in June of 2009. Small ceremony, backyard of a friend's house outside the city. I was the maid of honor. I gave a toast that made my father cry. Diane hugged me afterward and said, "He talks about you every day, you know, every single day." I believed her. The first thing that changed after the wedding was small. So small I almost didn't notice it. Diane asked my father if she could repaint the living room. The existing color, a deep terracotta that my mother had chosen, was a bit dark for her taste, she said. She'd found a lovely warm cream that would really open up the space. My father said yes. I said nothing. It was his house. It was her home now too. I told myself it was just paint. The second thing was the kitchen, the spice rack. My mother's spice rack, which she had hung herself with a level and 3 toggle bolts, had been in the same spot on the wall beside the window for 20 years. One afternoon I came to Sunday dinner and it was gone. In its place was a new rack, sleek, magnetic, modern. The old one, Diane told me cheerfully, was looking a little dated, and she'd found just the thing at a home goods store in Easton. I found the old rack in the recycling bin. I took it home with me. I told my father later that evening. He looked uncomfortable, not guilty, exactly, but like a man who was hoping I wouldn't press. He said he'd meant to save it for me. He said things had just moved fast. "It's okay, Dad," I said, because what else was I going to say? I put the spice rack in my own apartment, in my kitchen, and I thought, this is how it goes. This is the natural order of things. She's making her home. That's allowed. I kept telling myself versions of that for 3 more years. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing I want you to understand most clearly, because when I look back now and try to map it, it looks so obvious. A straight line from the spice rack to the deed, but living it felt like fog. You couldn't see the shape of what was happening until you were already deep inside it. By 2011, 2 years into the marriage, the living room and kitchen had been repainted. The old bedroom furniture my parents had shared, a heavy oak set my grandparents had given them as a wedding gift, had been replaced with something from a catalog. A framed photo of my parents on their wedding day, which had hung in the hallway for 30 years, was no longer on the wall. When I asked my father where it was, he said it was in a box somewhere, he'd find it. He never found it. My mother's rose bushes along the south fence were taken out in the fall of 2012. Diane said they hadn't been maintained properly and were getting leggy. She put in ornamental grasses instead. My father told me about it apologetically over the phone. "You know, I don't really know anything about gardening," he said. "It's fine, Dad." That was what I said, every time. What I did not say, what I was only beginning to form in the back of my mind, was that it was not fine. That something deliberate was happening. That Diane was not renovating a house. She was erasing a history. But I had no proof of that. All I had were feelings. And feelings, I knew from my work as a paralegal, were not evidence. The change in my relationship with my father was more subtle and more painful than any paint color or rose bush. It happened through scheduling. Through availability. I would call on a Sunday afternoon, and Diane would answer the phone and say my father was resting. I would suggest dinner on a Thursday, and she would say Gerald wasn't feeling up to going out. By the time I would finally see him, at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at a birthday lunch I had to push for, he seemed slightly behind a glass wall. Present but muffled. He would look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then Diane would say something to redirect the conversation, and he would follow her lead. He was not a weak man, my father. I want to be clear about that too. Gerald Calloway was a man who had raised a daughter alone for 7 years, who had worked the same job for 31 years, who had fixed every problem in that house with his own hands. But he was also 63 years old and had developed a heart condition in 2011 that required medication and a lifestyle his cardiologist described as managed. And he loved Diane. Even now, knowing everything I know, I believe he genuinely loved her, which made it harder to see what she was doing to him, and harder to say anything. The thing that made me start keeping records was a phone call. It was March of 2013. My father called me, not Diane calling to manage the call, him directly, from what sounded like his cell phone, maybe from outside. His voice was careful in a way that felt like he was measuring each word. "Miriam," he said, "I want to make sure you know that the house is yours. Whatever happens, you understand me." I said, "Dad, what's going on?" "Nothing's going on," he said quickly. "I just want to make sure you know, okay, the house is yours." Then Diane's voice in the background, "Gerald, who are you talking to?" And my father, his voice shifting to casual, "Just Miriam, honey, be right in." I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after that call ended. I wrote it down. The date, the time, every word I could remember. I put it in a folder I kept in my desk at work. I didn't know yet what I was building. I only knew I needed to start building it. In the autumn of 2014, my father had a mild cardiac event. Not a full heart attack. His cardiologist was careful to make that distinction, but serious enough to land him in Riverside Methodist Hospital for 4 days and to put everyone on alert. Diane handled everything. That was the word she used. "I'm handling it, Miriam. You don't need to come up every day. I'll call you if anything changes." The hospital was 12 minutes from my apartment. I went anyway. We sat in my father's room with the particular politeness of two people who are not saying the real things they're thinking. When my father came home, Diane began talking about estate planning. She was matter-of-fact about it, reasonable, even. Gerald needed his affairs in order, she said. It was responsible. She had spoken to a lawyer, a man named Douglas Feld, whose office was in Dublin, Ohio. He would come to the house. Douglas Feld came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I know this because my father mentioned it to me afterward, not in a way that seemed notable, just in passing, the way you'd mention any errand. He said they had signed some papers. Advance directive, power of attorney, things like that. "Just the usual things," he said. "Did you read everything before you signed?" I asked. A pause. "Diane went through it all with me," he said. I noted that this was not the same thing as yes. I wrote it down. What I would not discover, until 3 years later, was that among the documents my father signed that afternoon was a limited power of attorney that granted Diane authority over real property decisions related to the house drafted. I would eventually learn, in language just vague enough to be weaponized. My father had not been given a plain language explanation of what it meant. He had been told it was part of the standard estate package. He had trusted the word of a woman he loved, and a lawyer she had hired. He had also, on the same afternoon, signed a document that appeared to add Diane's name to the property deed as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. Whether he understood the implications of that it would supersede the prior designation I didn't yet know about, I cannot say. His dementia diagnosis would not come for another 2 years, but his cardiologist's notes from that period would later reference some cognitive cloudiness related to his medication adjustment. I didn't know any of this in 2014. I knew only that my father seemed more tired after that afternoon, and that Diane seemed, somehow, more settled. Like someone who has finished moving into a place and can finally rest. My father was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia in January of 2016. He was 70 years old. The next 2 years are the part of this story I find hardest to tell, not because of what Diane did, but because of what was happening to my father independent of any of it. The Gerald Calloway who had called me in March of 2013 to tell me the house was mine, careful, deliberate, trying to give me something, was slowly being replaced by a man who sometimes could not remember what day it was, who sometimes looked at me with a warmth that had no name attached to it, who was losing the specific weight of himself. Diane managed his care the way she managed everything, completely. She hired a part-time aide named Rosario, a gentle woman from Ecuador who came 3 mornings a week. She coordinated with his doctors. She kept the house immaculate. From the outside, from my vantage point, which she controlled carefully, it looked like devotion. I was allowed to visit on Sundays. Not every Sunday, some Sundays my father was having a harder day and it wasn't a good time. When I was there, Diane was always present. There was never a moment when I was alone with my father. He died on a Wednesday morning in February of 2018. Quietly, in his own bed, with Diane beside him. Rosario had just arrived and came to get her. I was called 40 minutes after he was already gone. I do not believe Diane had anything to do with his death. I want to state that clearly. My father died of the things that had been trying to kill him for years. He died in his own home. Whatever else is true about Diane Pollock, he was cared for at the end. That is a thing I hold on to. The funeral was a week later. I helped plan it. Diane and I sat across from each other at the funeral home and divided the decisions between us with the same careful politeness as always. She wore dark navy. I wore black. We both cried. Afterward, people from the church came back to the house. Neighbors, my father's old coworkers. My cousin Yvette, who had driven up from Cincinnati with her husband, stood beside me in the kitchen and held my hand. "You doing okay?" she kept asking. "I'm doing okay," I kept saying. The notice came 3 months later. It was a Tuesday in May. I came home from work. I had a long day, a deposition that went sideways, I was tired, and there was an envelope tucked into my door. It was from a real estate attorney's office. The letter inside informed me that the property at 1142 Weller Street, Columbus, Ohio, had been transferred and was under contract for sale, and that if I had any personal belongings remaining on the property, I should make arrangements to collect them within 30 days. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on my kitchen floor, still in my work clothes, and I stayed there for a long time. I was not named as an owner of the property. I had not been notified of any sale. I had not been consulted. I had been sent a letter about my childhood home the way you'd send a letter to a stranger about a storage unit. I called Diane. She answered on the second ring. "The house is mine, Miriam," she said before I had finished my sentence. Her voice was not unkind. It was, somehow, worse than unkind. It was patient, the voice of someone explaining something obvious. It was put in my name. "Your father and I made that decision together. I'm sorry if this is hard to hear, but this is what Gerald wanted." "He told me the house was mine," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. "I understand you believe that," Diane said. "But what matters is what the paperwork says." She said good night. She hung up. I sat there on my kitchen floor and thought about every document I had filed in my 9 years as a paralegal. I thought about every client who had come into our office saying I didn't read it. I trusted him. I thought about my father's voice in March of 2013. "The house is yours. Whatever happens, you understand me." I got up off the floor, I opened my laptop, and I started to look. Her name was Constance Wilder. She was 74 years old, lived in the White Cape Cod directly across the street from the house on Weller Street, and had been my father's neighbor for 38 years. Constance Wilder was a retired school librarian who kept meticulous records of everything: her grocery expenditures, her weather observations, her bird sightings, the comings and goings on Weller Street. Not because she was nosy. Because she told me, I like knowing what's real. Memory is unreliable, paper isn't. I had known Constance my entire life. She had babysat me as a child. She had brought casseroles when my mother was sick. She had stood at the edge of our yard on the day we buried my mother and cried without making any sound. I called her the morning after I received the letter. I was wondering when you'd call, she said. We met at her kitchen table. She made tea. She brought out a notebook, a green spiral-bound notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore, and she set it on the table between us. I started keeping notes in 2013, she said, after the man came with the survey equipment. I looked at her. A survey crew came to the property in August of 2013, Constance said, tapping the notebook. 2 men with equipment. They were there for about an hour and a half. Gerald wasn't home. Diane signed something for them. I wrote it down because I thought it was strange. She had been writing things down for 5 years. She had notes on the lawyer's visit in November of 2014, Douglas Feld's name, his license plate number, the time he arrived and the time he left. She had notes on a second visit from a different attorney in 2016. She had written down dates when she had seen lights on in the house very late at night, when she had seen Diane on the phone in the backyard, when she had seen Rosario the aide leave work in tears. Rosario, I said, do you know where she is now? I have her number, Constance said, and turned to a page near the back of the notebook. I sat at Constance Wilder's kitchen table for 2 hours. When I left, I had photographs of every relevant page of her notebook, Rosario's phone number, the name of the second attorney who had visited in 2016, and something more important than any of those things. I had a witness who had been paying attention while everyone else, including me, had been looking away. Your father loved that house, Constance said at the door. But what he loved more was knowing it would be yours. He told me that. He sat on this very porch the summer before he got sick, and he told me that whatever happened, that house was for you. He said it was the one solid thing he was sure of. I made it to my car before I started crying. There is a Sunday in October of 2017 that I go back to more than any other. Diane had a church function that afternoon, some committee meeting she couldn't skip. For the first time in years, I had 3 hours alone with my father. Rosario stayed for the first hour, and then she had to leave for another appointment, and then it was just the 2 of us. His dementia was moderate by then. Some days he was mostly himself. Some days he was very far away. That Sunday, he was somewhere in between, present enough to know me, present enough to be glad I was there, but drifting at the edges. He kept losing the thread of what he was saying mid-sentence, and then picking up somewhere new. We sat at the kitchen table. Not the original table that had been replaced too, like everything else, but it was still the kitchen. The window still faced the backyard. The afternoon light still came through it at the same angle it always had. He held my hand across the table. He did that sometimes now, held on like you hold something you're afraid of losing. You know what I think about, he said. I think about the time you broke the window. He meant the basement window, when I was 11 and trying to teach myself how to pitch. I had broken it with a wild throw, and I had been so scared of telling him that I had gone back inside and pretended it hadn't happened for 3 days until he found it. He had made me fix it myself, under his supervision, which had taken an entire Saturday. I had hated every minute of it. Now I would give anything to have that Saturday back. You were so mad at yourself, he said. You were always too hard on yourself, Miriam. I know, I said. The house is yours, he said, just like that. No preamble, the same words he had said on the phone 4 years earlier. I made sure of it. I looked at him very carefully. He was looking at the window. Dad, I said quietly, where did you make sure? He was quiet for a moment. Then, the lockbox. He touched the side of his head lightly as if trying to find the word. In the closet, in the back. Your bedroom closet. The back, he said again. And then he drifted somewhere else, started talking about a fishing trip he and his father had taken in the 1960s, something about a lake in Michigan, and I let him go. I sat with his hand in mine, and I listened to him talk about a lake in Michigan, and I thought about a lockbox in the back of a closet. When Diane came home at 5:30, I was in the kitchen washing the cups we had used for tea. My father was asleep in his chair. She looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Then she looked at my father, then back at me. Did you have a good visit? She asked. We did, I said. Thank you for the time with him. I did not tell her what he had said. I did not tell her about the lockbox. I drove home and I wrote everything down, every word, exactly as he had said it, and I added it to my folder. That was the last time I had a real conversation with my father. By December, the good Sundays had stopped. By February, he was gone. The lockbox was in that closet the whole time. After I received the notice of sale, I pulled every public record I could access. In my work as a paralegal, I had spent 9 years helping attorneys pull property records, deed histories, chain of title. I knew exactly what to look for and where to find it. I went to the Franklin County Recorder's Office website. I searched the property address. The deed history was right there, public record. In November of 2014, the month of Douglas Feld's visit, a deed had been recorded transferring the property to Gerald Calloway and Diane Paula Calloway as joint tenants with right of survivorship. My father's name had been on the original deed. Now Diane's name was beside it. And as a joint tenant with right of survivorship, when my father died, his interest passed automatically to Diane. No will required. No probate. The house simply became hers the moment he died. But there was something else in the deed history, something older. In 2007, 4 years before Diane, 2 years before she was even a thought, my father had filed an updated deed. I almost missed it because it was not at the top of the history. I had to scroll back, but it was there. Gerald Thomas Calloway, transferring an interest in 1142 Weller Street to Gerald Thomas Calloway and Miriam Jane Calloway, as tenants in common. He had added me to the deed in 2007. He had done it quietly, without telling me, without telling anyone. But then in 2014, a new deed had been recorded, the one Diane had arranged with Douglas Feld, that appeared to sever the tenancy in common and create a new joint tenancy between my father and Diane. If that 2014 deed was valid, my interest had been extinguished. The question was whether it was valid, whether my father had had the legal capacity to sign it, whether the power of attorney Diane held had actually authorized it, and whether my father had understood what he was signing. These were not small questions. These were the questions of a lawsuit. I drove to the house on Weller Street on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after I received the notice. Diane was not home. I had verified this by calling and getting voicemail, and then by driving past first. I had a key. My father had given it to me years ago, and no one had ever asked for it back. I went in through the front door. The house smelled different now, lavender, something artificial. The floors were the same. The staircase was the same. I went upstairs to my father's bedroom, Diane's bedroom now, and I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went to the closet. I pushed past the hanging clothes, past the shelf with the spare blankets to the back. The lockbox was there. Gray metal, small, a combination lock. I did not know the combination. I thought about what I knew about my father. I tried my mother's birthday, didn't open. I tried my own birthday, didn't open. I tried the year the house was purchased, 1981, the lock clicked. Inside was a manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a deed I had never seen, had never known about. It was dated March 15, 2011, before the estate planning meeting with Feld, before the cardiac event, before any of it. It was a deed conveying an undivided 1/2 interest in the property, at 1142 Weller Street, to Miriam Jane Calloway. It had been notarized by a notary named Patricia Simmons at a UPS store location in Worthington. It had never been recorded. He had prepared it. He had had it notarized. He had locked it away. And then, somehow, whether through confusion or illness or manipulation, he had signed something in 2014 that Diane's attorney would later argue superseded it. There was also a handwritten note in the envelope, in my father's handwriting. Miriam, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong. This house belongs to you. It was always going to be yours. Take this to someone you trust and make them listen. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. Dad. I sat on the floor of his closet for a long time. Then I put the deed and the note back in the envelope, put the envelope under my coat, and I walked out of the house on Weller Street for what I believed might be the last time. I was wrong about that. Her name was Angela Brecht. She was 52 years old, a partner at Brecht and Holloway in Columbus, and she had spent the last 20 years doing almost nothing but estate litigation and property fraud cases. My firm's senior partner had mentioned her name once, in a context I hadn't thought much about at the time. If you ever need someone who will go all the way to the wall on a property case, Angela Brecht is your person. I called her office on a Monday morning. I got a paralegal. I said it was a property dispute involving a potentially forged deed transfer, a dementia patient, and a handwritten note from the deceased. The paralegal put me on hold. Angela Brecht picked up herself 2 minutes later. Come in Thursday, she said. Bring everything. I brought everything. Angela Brecht was a compact woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the manner of someone who had heard every version of every story and was interested in exactly the parts that mattered. She went through my documents methodically. The 2007 deed showing my tenancy in common, the 2011 unrecorded deed from the lockbox, my father's handwritten note, Constance Wilder's notebook records, my own written notes from the 2013 phone call and the 2017 Sunday visit. She read everything without commenting. Then she looked at me, over her glasses. The 2011 deed, she said. Unrecorded, tell me about the notary. I told her what I knew. The UPS store in Worthington, the notary name. We'll verify she's active and that the seal matches, Angela said. If that notarization holds, and if we can establish your father's capacity in 2014 was compromised, or that the power of attorney Diane held did not actually authorize severing your tenancy, then we have a case. What kind of case? A deed challenge. We'd seek to void the 2014 deed and have the property interest reverted to the 2007 tenancy in common, which would give you a 50% undivided interest in the property. At minimum, she paused, it will be a fight. Her attorney will argue the 2014 deed was properly executed and supersedes. We will argue it was obtained through undue influence on a vulnerable adult, potentially without his informed consent, and using a power of attorney that exceeded its actual scope. How long? 12 to 18 months, realistically, if they want to litigate every step longer. I thought about the notice of sale, the 30-day window. Can we stop the sale? I asked. We can file for an injunction to halt the transfer pending litigation, Angela said. That's the first thing we do. She closed the folder. I want to take this case, Miriam, but I need you to be prepared. This is going to require Rosario's testimony. It's going to require the cardiologist's records, the dementia specialist's records, your father's medical history. Diane will fight this hard because she has to. If we win, she loses the property she's been planning to sell. I know, I said. And Miriam, she looked at me steadily. The note from your father, that's significant, not legally binding on its own, but it's going to matter. Juries remember notes from dead fathers. I drove home and I called Constance Wilder. I found an attorney, I said. Good, Constance said. Tell me what you need. I'm going to need you to testify. A short pause. I've been waiting 5 years for someone to ask me that, she said. Angela filed for the injunction first, before anything else. The sale was halted within 9 days. Diane's attorney, a man named Richard Garland, from a larger firm in Dublin, filed an immediate motion to dissolve it. The motion was denied. The property could not be sold while the case was pending. Diane called me the day after the injunction was granted. "I don't understand why you're doing this, Miriam," she said. She sounded tired, older. "Your father was clear about his wishes." "I have his wishes in his own handwriting," I said. "I'll see you in court." I hung up. I had never hung up on anyone in my life. The next 14 months were the longest of my life. I want to give you an honest account of what litigation like this actually feels like from the inside, because the movies make it look like a sequence of decisive moments, and the reality is almost entirely the opposite. It is discovery requests and document dumps. It is the other side asking for every piece of paper, every email, every text message related to my relationship with my father for the past 20 years, and Angela and I going through all of it, piece by piece, to determine what was relevant and what was protected. It is depositions, mine, Constance's, Rosario's, the cardiologist's, the dementia specialist's, Douglas Feld's, Diane's. It is sitting in a conference room, while Richard Garland asks you questions designed to make you sound like a grasping, resentful daughter who never accepted her stepmother. "Isn't it true that you opposed your father's marriage?" "No, I gave a toast at their wedding." "Isn't it true that you had a contentious relationship with Diane Pollock Calloway throughout the marriage?" "We had a polite relationship. I found out after my father's death that it was less mutual than I believed." Rosario was remarkable. She was a small woman, soft-spoken, who had come to this country from Ecuador 12 years ago and worked with dementia patients because, she said, they deserve someone who sees them. She testified about what she had witnessed during my father's final 2 years. His confusion about documents Diane would bring to him to sign, his frequent requests to call me that were redirected, a specific incident in the fall of 2016 when she had seen him try to use the telephone and Diane had taken it from him, saying he needed to rest. Rosario had told this to her supervisor at the home care agency. There was a record. The hardest part was a period of about 6 weeks in the middle of the litigation, month 8 or 9, when I genuinely thought we were going to lose. Diane's attorneys had filed a motion arguing that the 2011 deed, because it was never recorded, was legally ineffective. Angela responded that recording is a notice requirement, not a validity requirement, and that an unrecorded deed can still be enforceable between the parties. The judge took it under advisement for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, I stopped sleeping properly. I would wake at 3 in the morning and lie there going through every document in my head. I had given up weekends and evenings and the normal rhythms of my life for over a year. My friends had been patient. My boss at the firm, who understood, who had seen this kind of case before, had been patient. But I was tired in a way that went past tired. I called Constance one night during that period, later than I should have. "I don't know if we're going to win," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "What does Angela think?" "She thinks we have a strong case." "Then trust Angela," Constance said. "And Miriam, your father put that deed in that box for a reason. He knew something might go wrong. He trusted you to find it. Don't stop now." The judge ruled in our favor on the recording question. The 2011 deed was legally effective between the parties. The case would proceed. The hearing was in October of 2019, 18 months after I had received the notice, 14 months after I had first walked into Angela Breck's office with a manila envelope under my arm. The Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, Probate Division, Judge Carolyn Masters presiding. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Angela. I was wearing my gray suit, which I had bought for work interviews 6 years ago and had worn exactly twice since. Across the courtroom, Diane sat beside Richard Garland. She looked at me once when she came in. I looked back. Neither of us looked away first. It just ended, the way those things sometimes do without a winner. Constance Wilder testified that morning. She wore her good blue cardigan. She brought her notebook. Richard Garland tried to suggest that her record-keeping was eccentric and obsessive. Constance looked at him calmly and said, "I prefer to think of it as responsible. Memory is unreliable, paper isn't." I heard at least one person in the gallery suppress a laugh. The cardiologist's notes were entered into evidence, the references to cognitive cloudiness during the period of my father's medication adjustment in late 2014. The dementia specialist testified about the typical trajectory of vascular dementia and what it would have meant for Gerald Calloway's capacity to understand complex legal documents in the final years of his life. Douglas Feld was deposed rather than testifying live. His deposition transcript was read into the record. He had prepared the documents, he confirmed, based on instructions from Diane. He had not provided independent counsel to Gerald. He had not explained the implications of severing the existing tenancy in common. Angela saved my father's handwritten note for last. She had it on a document camera, so it was projected on a screen in the courtroom. My father's handwriting, familiar to me since childhood, a little unsteady by 2011, but unmistakably his. "Miriam, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong. This house belongs to you. It was always going to be yours. Take this to someone you trust and make them listen. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. Dad." The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Masters deliberated for 11 days. On November 4, 2019, she issued her written ruling. She found that the 2014 deed transfer had been obtained under circumstances that raised serious doubts about Gerald Calloway's informed consent, given his medical condition and the structure of the transaction. She found that the power of attorney Diane held had not explicitly authorized the severance of an existing tenancy in common and the creation of a new joint tenancy. She found Constance Wilder a credible and compelling witness. She found Rosario's testimony, supported by the home care agency's contemporaneous records, persuasive evidence of a pattern of restricting Gerald Calloway's independent communication and decision-making. She voided the 2014 deed. She ordered that the property revert to the 2007 tenancy in common designation, with the additional recognition of the 2011 deed's conveyance, giving me a controlling, undivided interest in the property. The house on Weller Street was mine. I did not cry in the courtroom. I sat very still while Angela explained what the ruling meant in practical terms. I shook her hand. I thanked her. I walked out into the November air. I called Constance from the parking lot. "We won," I said. She made a sound I had never heard from her before, something between a laugh and a sob. "Good," she said. "Good, your father would be so proud of you." I sat in my car for a while. I was not okay. I was also better than I had been in years. Both things were true at the same time, and I was too tired to sort out where one ended and the other began. What happened to Diane? I know people want to know this, so I'll tell you what I know and what I don't. Diane Pollock Calloway appealed the ruling. The appeal was denied 8 months later. During that period, she had been living in a rented apartment. She had moved out of the house after the injunction, on the advice of her own attorney, to avoid further complications. When the appeal was denied, Richard Garland sent Angela a letter formally acknowledging the ruling. There was no further contact from Diane. I do not know where she is now. I know from a mutual acquaintance that she moved back to Akron to be closer to her sister. I know from public records that the church she and my father had attended in Columbus showed her as no longer a member. I have not looked further than that. I have not tried to find her. I am not going to tell you I forgave her. I'm also not going to tell you I spend a lot of time thinking about her anymore. She is someone who tried to take something that was not hers, got very close to succeeding, and then did not. She will have to live with what she did. I think about my father who loved her genuinely and what it would do to him to know what happened. That is the part that still hurts. Not the house, him. As for Douglas Feld, Angela filed a complaint with the Ohio State Bar Association regarding his conduct in preparing the 2014 documents without providing independent counsel to Gerald. The investigation was ongoing as of the last time I checked. I do not know the outcome. I moved back into the house on Weller Street in January of 2020. It was strange. The lavender smell took months to fully clear. The ornamental grasses were still in the south yard where my mother's roses had been. The kitchen had that sleek magnetic spice rack, not the one my mother had put up with a level and 3 toggle bolts. The first weekend I was back, I went to Constance's kitchen table and had tea, the same as always. The second weekend, I started pulling up the ornamental grasses and researching rose varieties. The third weekend, my cousin Yvette came up from Cincinnati with her husband and a casserole, and we spent a Saturday doing exactly nothing in particular, just being in the house, just being there. It took a long time to feel like home again. It does feel like home now. Not exactly the same home, the rooms have been rearranged too many times, and I am not the same person I was when I lived here before. But the light through the kitchen window at 4 in the afternoon is exactly the same. The creak on the third stair is exactly the same. The flood mark on the basement wall that my father drew in 1983, that somehow no one ever painted over, is still there. I found my parents' wedding photo in a box in the attic. I hung it back in the hallway. The spice rack is back on the wall. Not the one my mother hung, that one is still in my old apartment, where it has been for years, because I couldn't bring myself to move it again. This one is a replica I found at an estate sale. Same style, same era, 3 toggle bolts hung with a level. It is in the same spot beside the kitchen window. Close enough. The lockbox is on my dresser. I emptied it, the deed is in Angela Breck's files, the original, properly indexed and recorded now, but I kept the box. I kept the combination, 1981. I kept my father's note. It is in the envelope in the box on my dresser. I take it out sometimes. Not often, just enough to remember that he was paying attention. That he was afraid something might go wrong, and he made a plan anyway. The only plan he knew how to make, which was to leave me a piece of paper and trust me to know what to do with it. He was right to trust me. I need you to know that I know that, not as vanity, as relief. He trusted me and I did not fail him. That is the thing I carry. My mother used to say, when things get uncertain, go back to what you know is solid. Go back to your foundation. I am back at my foundation. It is beige siding, faded to the color of old newspaper. A front porch that lists slightly to the left. A yard I water every summer and will never fully green. 1.5 bathrooms, a spice rack on the wall beside the kitchen window, and a flood mark in the basement from 1983 that I would not remove for anything in this world. It is not a beautiful house. It is the most important place in the world. If you've been watching this story and something in it felt familiar, if you recognize the fog, the politeness, the telling yourself it's fine, I want you to take something practical away from this. Document things, not because you're being paranoid, because memory is unreliable and paper isn't. Write down the date and what was said. Keep the emails. Take a photograph of the document before you sign it. These are not dramatic acts. They are ordinary acts that become extraordinary if something goes wrong. Second, if someone you love tells you that something belongs to you, even in passing, even in a confused moment, even on a bad day, write it down. The date, the words, exactly as they were said. My father told me the house was mine 3 times over 5 years in 3 different ways. I documented 2 of them. Those 2 records sat in a folder for years. They mattered. Third, if you think something has gone wrong with a property or an estate, talk to an estate litigation attorney before you assume there's nothing to be done. Many attorneys, Angela Brecht included, offer an initial consultation. Bring everything. Let them tell you what is possible. My name is Miriam Calloway. I am 38 years old. My father's house is behind me, and it's going to stay there. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of something you're carrying, or someone you're fighting for, leave it in the comments. I read everything. And subscribe because there are more of these stories, and some of them are going to surprise you. Take care of yourself. Go back to your foundation.